Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today here for our product hunt launch of the UXPin Merge NPM integration. Um, First of all, thank you for joining us. I'll get started here. Great. So my name is Jack Behar, and as I mentioned, we're here to learn about the Merge NPM integration, which we're very excited to launch today. I am the Merge onboarding specialist, which means I help teams onboard their UI components, their design systems onto UXPin Merge to enable component-driven prototyping. So today we're super excited to have this launch with Product Hunt. And of course, we asked that you join us on Product Hunt for today's launch. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your time. I know taking an hour of your busy day is a big deal. So thanks for coming. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at Merge NPM integration. So this is a designer-friendly way to import UI components onto UXPin. And by doing that, we can achieve new levels of fidelity and interactivity in prototyping. Smooth design handoff, as well as streamlining the whole product development process. And one that's dear to me is unifying designers and developers with a single source of truth. And the cool thing about this integration is that you'd be able to start component-driven prototyping today, as early as after this meeting or after this presentation by doing your own NPM integration. So let's talk a little bit about what we'll be discussing today. We'll look at the benefits of component-driven prototyping with UXPin Merge. We'll import a couple of components using Merge NPM integration so you can see that workflow. And then we'll switch over to a library that has been fully imported so we can explore the concept of component-driven prototyping. And then finally, we'll have a QA session. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly is Merge. So Merge is a feature of UXPin, UXPin being a full stack UX and UI design, prototyping, and collaboration platform. And what Merge does is it translates UI component code into a visual library within the UXPin editor that can then be configured by designers. Essentially, by integrating Merge into your workflow, your designers and developers will now be using a single source of truth in that code. So in this slide, you can see a couple of things. Starting here, you can see that we can import components from various processes, right? We can bring in components from Storybook or from my Git repo. But today we're here to see a simpler approach that decouples that dependency on either knowledge of code or having to be a developer in order to do this. So what you're seeing here is through NPM, we're able to bring in, say, this card component into the UXPin editor. And you'll notice that there is a component properties panel associated with that component. And designers are able to just modify those properties to create different renditions of the component. And in handoff, a developer can now leverage the code that is provided by UXPin, which is essentially the UI code that that is there, to begin with from your design system, and it passes and it provides the information to the developer to create that same exact variant. So what I'd like to do first is just show you that concept before we jump into some benefits. So here I am in UXPin, and in my libraries, I've selected a material UI library that has been brought in through an integration. And you'll notice when I drag that button out, looking at my layers, it's just a single coded component code node. So with this button now, I can select it and I can customize it by modifying the properties on the right. So I can easily pass a new label. These are the different color options that I have as part of my design system. So these are my tokens. And you can see how that changes. there are different variants of this button. Maybe I can choose a outline version versus a text version. And then, of course, you can pass any icons that you like to pass. Finally, we have all our events are also exposed, which allows you to set interactions, which we'll look at in a little while. But the important thing to note here is that when I preview this, it is important to realize that this is actual real browser behavior in these components. So this is not a smoke and mirrors just flipping artboards, for example. This is the actual code that is part of our design system. And you can see that that's true by noticing where that ripple starts when I click. So all the behaviors that are baked into that component are available. Also, this is our simulate mode, right? So you can simulate it, but by switching to spec mode, a developer can click on that button and link straight out to the documentation of that component and get the JSX code with your properties that you have modified to create that version of the component. So for the developer experience, it's rather simple. They're copying and pasting your component code that you have configured. So this is a very simple example of a component. However, we have various others available to us through this library. And I'll just show you a card, which will prove to be a little bit more evolved in this component because it has a nested composition. So in this case, we've brought out a card. And that card, you can now toggle and see how it's made up of other parts. Like, for example, the card media component, right now is set to show an image. But what if I wanted to show a video? I could do that by passing it a source to a video here. Also, all these components have their own set of properties. As you've noticed, the card header has its own sets. We looked at the card media. So all these nodes can be modified based on the capabilities of that component. And of course, a designer is free to modify the structure of the component if need be. Like, for example, maybe they don't need a card header, and maybe they want to take this button and drop it into that card header section, and then delete that initial button that was there to start with. So just a real simple demo of how we can leverage coded components on the UI editor. We'll look at this in a lot more depth. But for right now, I'd like to show you a feature that we're launching, which actually correlates really nicely with Merge. It now allows you to simply point to a design system online and import those components without the need of having a developer. So let's go ahead and start looking at why Merge is beneficial. And then we'll go ahead and import those components and start building with them. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of show you a visual of what we call the design development gap, right? It is essentially a gap between the two disciplines. And here is an analogy that Brad Frost, who's the creator of atomic design composition, he uses this as an analogy, right? It's of a fresco that was found in a little church in Spain, and it went through the restoration process, but due to the gap between the person in charge of the design of where it should be headed and the people in charge of actually doing the work, you can see what happened. They essentially created what's lovingly become to be known as the potato Jesus on the internet, and this town is now like a big tourist attraction because of it. But what's important to us is to note that just like this did not meet parity, we try to provide tools that would, right, through using any of the software that you probably currently use today, you can prototypes and assets and documentation. But of course, it doesn't quite bridge that gap. It compromises product drift, as well as it's a frustrating experience for designers and developers. It's very costly, and we can fix this problem. by utilizing merge. So here you're seeing the same. However, this time we're bridging that gap with code, those coded components, and it's this, and that will act as the source of truth. So now developers on the right are able to leverage those components via their React code. And then on the left, merge takes care of all that code translation and provides the components as a visual element in the UXPin editor that can then be modified via properties. So of course, by default, we will be creating high-five prototypes because all that functions and all those interactions are already built into the component itself. Of course, we're also going to be able to achieve pixel perfect parity between what designers design and what actually gets deployed. It's a much faster process to design and develop. It promotes code reuse and governance. And then now we have harmony between designers and developers because we're working with that same source of truth and speaking the same language. So let's go ahead and switch over back to Merge and show you NPM integration. So the first thing I'm going to do is I will create a new library by clicking on this new library button. And I'm presented with various options. I can either use the standard UXPin libraries. This is probably in parity to what you're used to in, say, Sketch or Figma. We can import coded components from a storybook build if you have that. We can import React components through a Git repo. This is our most advanced integration. It requires knowledge of development, and it's more geared towards our enterprise clients. However, today we're going to be looking at importing with the NPM integration. So I'll click on that and click on Next. And I'll give this library a name. We'll call it NPM test. And now we'll point to the library that we want to bring in. So let me show you what that means. In our case, for our purposes today, we're going to be demoing with the Material UI, now called Movie Library. And it's a React framework that has many components available to you right out of the box, as well as some pretty robust theming capabilities. And if you notice, a developer could leverage this library by installing it via this command in code, but we won't do that. All we need to really know is what the package is called. And in this case, it's called @movie/material. So by just knowing that information, we can come out, pull that package into UXPin, and then we can configure every component through an admin panel. Another example would be the Ant design library, another very popular one. If I go to the Get Starting section, you'll notice usually the first thing they tell us is how to install it, right? Again, that's that package name for Ant design, but we'll be looking at Movie. So as I mentioned, I just need to know the package name. So @movie/material, and I could enter it here. And I can specify a version of that component system that I want to bring in. We'll just go with latest. Now, keep in mind here, we're going to be importing a open source third-party library. But if your company has their own design system and it's built upon React components, you can point to their package, or your package, I guess I should say, and bring in those components that your developers are coding with. So after clicking, after specifying my version, I can click on Next. And then I am given an empty library with the option to open the Merge Component Manager. So the library is currently empty. So let's go ahead and add some components. We will be bringing in a few Material UI components, and I can show you what they look like. We'll bring in a button component. And as you notice, we can create various different versions of buttons. We'll also bring typography component in and a card component to use as a background. So each component has an obvious name, button, card, typography, and so on. And that's how I would pull in those specific components from each package. So back in my admin here, I can say I want to pull button from the material UI library, which we've already specified. And then we can also associate it with a category. So let's create a category for that. We'll call it inputs. And then let's go ahead and create add a couple more components. So card, it's another one. We'll add a category called surfaces. And then we'll add one more called typography. And then again, assigning it to a category, we'll just put it in inputs. And import components. So now it's going to say great work. Now we have association with components, but we need to now compile this library and push it out for you. So in order to do that, we click on the push library changes button. Now this process, the first time you publish a component, will take about a minute. And once that happens, the library will be available in UXPin, and now any update to that library will be a lot quicker than that minute. So while this processes, let's go ahead and talk about components, right? In case you're unfamiliar with the use of coded components, essentially they are a package of code, and based on the properties that a developer passes to that code, we get different renditions of it. So in this case, you notice how variant, text, contained, and outline produce these results. Of course, there's colors as well. We can pass colors as success or error. There's sizing and icons. So the main thing to know here, the only real background information you need to know is that components are a piece of code that are driven by the assigning of properties. And each design system has documentation on what those properties are. So in this case of a button, you can see there's a children property, which is just the label of the button. We have color options that you can pass to it, as well as sizes and variants. So let's go ahead and switch over back to our library and start configuring those properties so they become available in UXPin. Great. Okay, so we have our button here, and currently it's an empty component. There are no properties assigned. So now I can reference my properties table and bring in some of these properties. We'll start with children. So children is going to be the label of the button. It says the content of the component. And I can give it that property name, which is children. I can give it a description if I choose to. And then I can also give it a display name if I want to associate something differently here. So maybe instead of children, it makes more sense for a designer to call it label. And then we will set the property type. So it could be a function, it could be a true or false, a couple other concepts here of types. Node, which is the ability to be able to bring in other components inside of that component. Then we can go ahead and set it to node. As we saw in our table, it's a type node. So, and then I can give it a default. So let me just give it a label of click me. And you can start seeing the component preview starting to appear here. So we'll add that property, and then we'll create another property called variant. And then variant allows you to select either from contained, outlined, or text. In that case, we're going to use a select field. And now you can see how the contained parameter looks. Passing outlined will change it as well as text. So let's set the default to contained, add that property, and let's just add one more while we're at it. We'll do color. So the property is color. The property type again is enum, which is a selection of elements of values. And in this case, you can see we have primary, secondary, error, success, and so on. So these are the default tokens that are available in my design system, or I should say in Material UI's design system. If you are integrating with companies, you will have your own set of parameters. So now I can easily just save those changes and publish the library one more time. As I mentioned, usually the publish, the first time takes about a minute, but you can see it was just a few seconds on this round. And now I can go back to UXPin's editor and refresh that window. And I should now see those components brought in. So we just configured the button component, and you can now change that label, change that color, change the variant. Of course, we would go through and integrate more properties as the ones that you might need, or you might find that it's best to integrate all the properties. It's up to you. So let's just do one more component here, just to illustrate the process one more time. So we had already pointed to card, and now we need to get the properties of card. So looking at my card property table, I see that it just has a few properties, not that many. Children, raised is another one. So if it's true, it would have a race styling. We can see the descriptions here. So once again, children is just the content of that card. And we'll also bring in raised, which is a Boolean, meaning a true or false. So card, go ahead, property name will be children. Type is going to be node, and then you can see here the content of card. And then we'll add another property, this time raised, and we're going to select the property type as Boolean. Boolean is a true or false, and in this case, it's defaulting to false. But by clicking on true, you can see that it now has elevation. And we'll save that change as well. Publish the library. And now when I refresh my library, I see that I can bring in my card, and it's got my properties that we defined. I can set it to raised if I wanted to. And since it's got children, I could go into my layers and drag that button into my card. And you can see now we have a component that consists of having a button inside of it. And by looking at that spec code, a developer would be able to get either the whole composition to create the same exact chunk of design, or you can go into the layers and get just the code for, say, the button. So that is essentially the import process through NPM Manager. It's rather simple, but pretty powerful. Here you can see a library that we have incorporated. So this library has all the components from the Ant design package. You can see we have alerts, avatars, pretty much the works. This is all built in UXPin, by the way, this whole utilizing the same coded components that we see here. So for example, this component here would be the menu. And you can see all the variations that you can create with that menu. And then of course, it's all code, live code. So the experience itself is that it is legit. It's true one-to-one. You can use it for proper user testing and rapid prototyping. So this is the Ant library that's already there. Let's go ahead now and start using Merge. Let's change our library back to that one of the webinar workshop. And this library has all the components of Material UI brought in, so we can look at them in more detail. So we looked at a button and we looked at a card, which was pretty simple. But how about something like a menu? So I can drag that menu in, And when I preview it, you'll see that I can click on the menu and get the drop-down that is associated with it. So this is not static. This is 100% editable by the designer. So by going to my layers, I can see that the menu actually consists of menu items. And inside of that menu, we have different menu items with their own set of properties. So as I mentioned, we have my profile, my account, and log on. And that associates with the label, right? Children, my account, log off. And then you'll notice my account has a divider set. And of course, I can just take any one of these nodes, copy and paste them, and add a new one. And then when I preview that now, you'll notice that we added more to it. Again, no code was necessary here. All that code is baked in. You're just configuring the components themselves. So now menu also has some more options, right? Like maybe the trigger, instead of a button, it could be an icon. And maybe you can pass it whichever icon you see fit. And of course, you got your colors and whatever properties are available with that component. And then by previewing once again, I'll see that that changed from a button to that icon. So that's, again, a simple component called menu. Of course, we have many other ones. Let's look at something maybe a little more advanced, like a badge component. Okay, so bringing out this component, now you can see that I have various configurations when I click on that button, right? Like I can set the badge to either open and show on the top or maybe on the bottom. And you can see it reflect right on the canvas, not only in the preview, but as you're working with those components, you can see how they are being affected. We can give it a count of 3. Actually, let's give it a count of 20. But let's say the max that we're allowed to have shown is 15. So you'll notice how that changes from 20 to 15 plus. Different overlaps. Of course, we have variants such as dot versus standard. And then inside of that batch, you can see we have that an icon button, which has its own set of properties as well. Maybe this button is large and its primary color and so on. So you can now start seeing how we customize these components. And of course, you use the built-in tools of UXPin to lay out your prototype. So let's look at let's explore that a bit more with some really complex components. So here we've created templates out of these components. Let's say that we want to work with this header component. If we preview that, you see that it has a search box, it has a button here, and we want to explore what we can customize from this component. Surely we can say that it has a search or not, right? And we can toggle that flag. We can change the logo and also change the alt. If accessibility is important to you, those accessibility properties like the area labels and all that can be also exposed here. So when you're handing off to developers, now they even have all the accessibility information that should go along with this prototype. So I am noticing that there is a button available, but I don't have any option to modify that button. That lends me to believe that that button is actually part of a nested element inside of the header. In other words, this section here can be modified. So once again, maybe I'll look for that menu component, drag it out. You can see it put it right in that section. And then maybe the button can be, let's call it account. account circle, right? Oops, sorry, I was in the wrong component. So here under icon, I can call it account circle. And then the variant, the trigger itself is going to be changed to icon. So now you can see how we added that icon there. And when we preview it, we have that associated drop-down menu with it as well. And of course, you can modify that as you see fit. Let's look at one more component here called a side navigation component that was also brought in. And with this component, you see that we have different scenarios. We have one that has a control. This essentially is just the list items. These aren't buttons. However, this is, right? And we can toggle secondary navigation within it. So how do we customize this more complex component? We just do it in the same way. We explore its composition. We see that side navigation has a list. List has some properties. For example, dense will change the padding of this component. You can see that being affected. And then within list, I have all these different list items. So I can modify the properties to create different versions of that list item. So for example, inbox, we want to set that to a button, and maybe it's collapsible. Let's show it in the collapsed state. And then I can take any of those nodes and drop it in, or I could look for another list item in my library. Usually once you have components on the page, it turns out to be a lot faster just to copy and paste elements into right into the tree or the prototype, and then I can drag this inside of that inbox item that we created, and we can obviously pass other properties as we see fit for now this element. And I can delete these, and now we have side navigation, a second level navigation available. So remember earlier when I told you that not only are we bringing in components visually, but we're bringing in their code and their events as well. So let's say I want to take this list item, this side navigation that has that list item, and we want to show it in the collapse state. Okay, this is our initial state. And let's imagine we have a button. Or actually, we can utilize the same icon right here, because it's an icon button. And that icon button now has interactions. See, it has a click event. So when I click on that, I can now bind interactions to that click event. And there are plenty of interactions that you can choose from. We can hide elements, set variables on the page. We can scroll to different places, change states of components, animations, set content, but more importantly, what's important to us for this demo is the set coded component property. So by doing that, I can select my element that I want to modify. In this case, we are going to go with one of the list items that was inside of there. I should have named this in my we should have named this prior in our layer to make it a little easier to find. But what we can do is just show that button as uncollapsed. And then we can call this one like list item and then I don't know, inbox. Okay. So now you'll notice that once we do have that that name available to us, you should be able to find it in your tree a lot easier. So going back to this button, I can set the trigger to click and then set that property of, this time we see list item inbox. And what we're going to say is we are going to select it as collapsed, add. And now when I click on this, I will see that this list item will collapse. So bear with me here. I'm going to go back to my properties. Okay, so the property is going to be collapsed equals true, save. So now that interaction is saved, and when I click on the notifications button, I now have that interaction. Very simple example of an interaction, but you can imagine it open dialogues and collapsing a whole navbar, any kind of functionality that you can create between communicating with the two components. So now you can start seeing how by adopting this process, you're able to utilize the same source of truth from a developer that a developer does. You were able to bring in these components from your library without having to access any developer resources. And then you were able to create some high fidelity prototypes right out of the box without having to know any code. The last thing I'd like to show you is that we do offer various integrations. So currently, we are showcasing the NPM import, which is the new feature that is currently being launched today. And again, we encourage you to visit Product Hunt and join us. But essentially, that is the new feature that we're promoting today. However, natively, we can bring storybook integrations as well. And our most robust integration would be the Git repo integration, which allows you to not only bring code in, but provide a lot more capabilities, such as version control. As an example, right? You can take a design system, have another version associated with that design system, and swap the prototype to see how that design system is adapting to that change. So with that, I mean, I'd like to open it up to questions, and if there are any, I see I have some in the QA tab. That's great. Okay, so Daniel, are there any plans to support Vue? Great question. So currently Merge is a React-based tool. However, with React wrappers, in a Git integration approach, you could import web components. And if there is any kind of connection you can make with a Vue integration, you should be able to pass it through a React wrapper as well. But no, I mean, out of the box, especially with MCM integration, it has to be a React library. Sultan, why not an option to add all components? Yeah, I agree, 100%. So as I mentioned, this is our phase 1 of our release, and it will actually grow quite a bit. Not only will you have the option to import all the components, but also it will be able to sniff out all the properties and bring them in by default, so you wouldn't have to bother configuring anything. One thing that I did not show, and this might be a good opportunity to do that, is that with NPM or with any merge library, really, you can create patterns from those atoms, right? Those building blocks that are available in your design system. So let's say you bring out a card and maybe rating, and say now this card is in your design system and you want to create a new rendition of a card. A designer can come in here and start modifying the elements, the structure itself. So I can take this rating, put it in between the two, and so on. So let's say now we have this new card that differs from our original card that we brought in, right? It looked like this previously. We have a section called patterns, which will allow you to select the new pattern you composed and add it to that library. And now you have it available in your library for any team member that has access to the library to use. So with this in mind of having patterns, there are going to be enhancements to the NPM import, which will allow you to start sharing and providing this composition back to your developer to be able to just copy that JS code and place it into the app. So great question, thank you. Can you save this as an instance and then submit a pull request? Sultan, again, great question. So you can indeed create that composition, like we said, in patterns, and then you can, a developer would be able to preview it, get that JSX code, and since you're working with the same source of truth, utilizing those lower level components such as image and the background and typography, they would be able to build this, this version of the component and push it into the library. In the future, we will also be incorporating two-way process where it now can talk to your repo and create a pull request. Janice, you want to see tables? Yeah, and that's a big one, right? For designing tables is horrible. It's like the worst. So let me show you an example of a table. Bear with me as I switch to another account that has a different library. Okay, so in our UXPin boilerplate, we have a table component. I'm going to show you one approach of a way that a table component might be configured. It all depends on the component itself, right? In this case, you can see this component is already built in to have sorting. And if I preview that, I see that the sorting works. So how is this data being brought in? It comes in through this object, and essentially you can export any Excel sheet or any Google sheet. You can export it in this format, and I can add another record here manually if I wanted to. And when I click away, you'll now see that new record become available down here. So this is just a simple example of sorting a table and bringing data in. Of course, if you had a more robust component that might have other properties such as filtering, sorting, and so on, it can all be configured from this top level and you won't have to manually create any more records. However, also in Material UI, you have access to just the basic table components. And this table component now is going to look and behave a little different than the one where we previously showed. So the one that we previously showed is calling on data via this object. However, this other one is actually built with nodes. So you got your table rows, you have all your table cells that you can modify, and then table rows has its own set of properties, right? Like selected and so on. And you can just easily add another row, or take another row, add it in there, and then each row has its own set of cells that you can now bring in anything you want, like maybe a checkbox, and let's see what else can bring in. Maybe actually bring in an icon. And then you can now start seeing how you take those components and you can drop them into each cell. So maybe we want to drop it to that. We want to drop that checkbox in that first cell, and then maybe the icon in that third cell. And you can start seeing how you build it out. So as you learn to use your components, your opportunities will grow dramatically with using layout components such as grids and any of anything that is provided in your design system itself. Finally, I want to also mention that through an NPM integration, you could bring in components from different design systems. So let's say Ant Design has a table component that you really like. You could bring in the Material UI button, and then you can bring the Ant Design table in under the same library, if that's something that you need for your process. All right. Bear with me here. I'm looking through the questions to see if we have anything else we can discuss. I think I'm caught up on all the questions unless anybody has any other questions. Okay. Well, with that said, I love to invite you to join us in our excitement with our launch of this feature. And also we invite you to create a trial, which will give you access to the NPM library. And you'd be able to bring your own, either your company's coded components or any third-party component that you might have available. And with that, again, I thank you and look forward to seeing your work on UXPin. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.